I opened up my email this morning and got an email from a gal by the name of Rhiannon. She's in her early 20s, and she shared with me her My Church story. She said when she was she grew up kind of coming to this church, and when she was 13 years old, her aunt passed away, and we did a memorial service for her. And a little while later, a couple months later, she really kind of personalized this faith of hers. Like, no, this Jesus thing, this is something that I'm choosing, not just for my parents, because my parents raised me to know this, but I'm really choosing this. She got baptized here at her church, and what she said, that's the moment where this church became my church. Now, the interesting thing about her story was, I just read it this morning, and when I read it, she lives in Ripon, California, and she's not able to be here on Sundays. But she reminded me that there's a whole community of people who are online who watch our messages every week. And I sometimes forget that. And so they're going to be watching this service at some point today or this week. And so to Rhiannon and all of you online, in our online community, you're our extended family. And so welcome. We're super glad that you guys are with us. And thank you for sharing your My Church story. I hope you have one too. It's good. This morning, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you the Christmas story, but I'm going to tell you the Christmas story you've never heard before, okay? So if you have a Bible, I want you to open to Isaiah chapter 7. Isaiah 7. And let me first start with this. You've been keeping an eye on the fires in Southern California? What's going on down there? They're still going on, and Santa Barbara's kind of in jeopardy right now. Let me introduce you to these three people on the screen. This is Kathy Orchard, Don Philip Barr, and then Don's stepson, Todd Smith. Last weekend, they were in one of the firestorms in Southern California known as the Lilac Fire. They all got orders to evacuate, and these three stayed behind. And they said, we're gonna rescue our homes and our neighborhood if we can. And Kathy said, don't do this. I'm not recommending you do this. She said, the only reason we're staying behind is because we know what we're doing. Kathy's worked for the fire department for 28 years, retired as a fire chief. Don was a firefighter for 8 years. His stepson, Todd, he's just crazy enough to stay behind too. And that qualified him, I guess. So Thursday morning, around 11:30, they saw the plumes of smoke rising in the distance. And as they got to higher ground, they felt about a 40-mile-an-hour wind. They knew that fire was going to get to their neighborhood. They knocked on doors, made sure all the neighbors got out, and they stayed. Kathy goes to her garage and she unpacks these boxes that have retired fire hoses in them, and she hooks them up to these fire hydrants, and they determine what their lines of defense are going to be, and they wait. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when the embers started flying overhead and igniting homes in their neighborhood on fire. So they started putting out hot spots here and there, and at one point, Don goes to his neighbor's house, and the neighbor's front door is on fire. And he can't get a fire hose to stretch there, so he's fighting a fire with their garden hose, and he saves their house. This firefighting goes on all night long. These three, which they've kind of dubbed themselves the Three Musketeers. They just felt like, you know what, we're taking on a huge firestorm by ourselves in our neighborhood. And by the time morning came, the entire landscape around their neighborhood was charred. All these homes around their neighborhood had been burned to the ground. But there's a section of their neighborhood that they saved. They not only saved their homes, but they saved a bunch of their neighbors' homes to say, we're going to be a part of this rescue. We're going to rescue our neighborhood. And the reason I tell you that story is just simply to say this. The Christmas story, at the very heart of it, is a rescue story. It is God's rescue of humanity. And God's rescue doesn't actually begin with Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus. Part of God's rescue goes way back into the Old Testament. There's lots of rescue stories. If you ever read through the Old Testament, God is constantly rescuing his people from enemy, from dangers. I want to tell one of those stories to you. On the front of your notes, there's a map there. I'm going to give you a couple fill-ins on that map. The first one is this. The king all the way to the south down there, the king of Judah. Guys, name is Ahaz, King Ahaz. Write that name in there just so we can keep all this straight. You see, God's people used to be 12 tribes, known as Israel. But at some point, 10 tribes in the north broke away, started becoming more of a godless nation, not respecting who God was. But 2 tribes in the south became known as Judah, and their king was King Ahaz. Now, Judah and the tribe to the north now, those 10 tribes, were now known as Israel. Okay, you got to know when you talk about Israel, because sometimes Israel's God's people, and other times when you talk about the 10 tribes of Israel, they started wandering away from God. Now, they had a king too. His name was King Pekah, P-E-K-A-H, all right? Write that in there. He's the king of Israel. And to the north of that is Syria. And their king was his name was Rezin, R-E-Z-I-N. I just want you to be able to keep all these 3 nations straight. Now, to the northeast of all of them, including Syria, was Assyria, all right? Different group of people. This era and this time where Isaiah 7 was written, they started having this problem because Assyria was becoming unbelievably powerful. They were conquering, they were coming from the east and moving their way west, and they would make their way up into Syria eventually. And Syria knew there's no way we're going to stand a chance to fight these guys. But if King Rezin can get King Pekah and King Ahaz to all come together, maybe our 3 nations, if we band together, maybe we can fight the Assyrians. Now, in the midst of that, you got to understand, these 3 nations on the screen did not like each other or trust each other. But they knew if we have a common enemy, we need to come together. So the top 2 kings there with Rezin and Pekah, they come together and they say, okay, we're going to fight the Assyrians. They go to King Ahaz and say, King Ahaz, we want you to come and fight alongside of us. Here's the problem. King Ahaz is trying to lead God's nation, God's people, in a godly way, even though he doesn't do it very well. And King Ahaz, he has trouble partnering with these guys. Number 1, he doesn't trust them. Number 2, both of those nations have all these pagan kings. They cut a tree down, out of wood, carve a structure, and bow down to it as their god. There's some odd things about that. You just made your own god. But it's a pagan nation. And King Ahaz is like, I don't think God would want us to be a part of that. But he's, what do I do, God? I mean, I'm going to get destroyed by Assyria, but these 2 nations want us to join them. So King Ahaz thinks he has 2 options. Here's my 2 options. You either side with King Pekah or King Rezin, or you side with the Assyrians. You know how you make that decision? You side with the winners. You side with the biggest force because you want to be on the winning team. Because if you don't win the battle, what's going to happen is they're going to come and kill the king and send away everybody from the city. And that could actually ruin an entire group of people. You will never be a people again. Your whole country will be decimated. So the 2 kings to the north, Syria and Israel, decide, we're going to go in and we're going to get King Ahaz. We're going to battle him and we're going to kill him. And we're going to put a new king in his place, one who's much more friendly to us. And then the 3 of us, we can all join forces together. Ahaz, in this moment, listen, he sees 2 options: join Assyria or join the forces to the north. God, what am I going to do? He's absolutely terrified. And so in his terror, God intervenes and steps in. And he sends him a man by the name of Isaiah, who this book is written by and after. Isaiah, he's a prophet. Now, you got to know this about a prophet. Prophets just speak for God. God talks to the prophet. The prophet disperses God's message to the people. I'm in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3. Here's where this story picks up, where God intervenes. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct in the upper pool on the road to the launder's field." A bunch of maybe useless information. You know why he's there? He's out checking his water lines is what he's doing. You know why? Because he knows that either Assyria or those 2 other nations are going to come down and try and lay siege on their city and cut off the water supply. People can't live without water, right? So the king is taking action, trying to do something about this threat. God says, Isaiah, go out there and give him this message. Verse 4, say to him, be careful, keep calm, don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood. Get this. He's referring to the kings, the two kings to the north. Don't think those guys are a threat. They're nothing but charcoal. They're nothing but two small stubs of smoldering wood. They have no power. He goes on. Because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin. Those names, it all refers to those same two kings. Let us invade Judah. Let us tear it apart. Let us divide it amongst ourselves. Make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. Okay, that's the plan that we've talked through. Here's what God says in response to it. It will not take place. It will not happen. That's verse 7. God says, listen, Ahaz, you think you have two options. Join the guys to the north or join the Assyrians. There's a third option. Here's your third option. Ask me what I think about it. He's saying you haven't stopped and paused and said, God, what do you want in the midst of this? Now listen, you and me, we've probably never had a King Ahaz moment, right? There's two countries to the north. We only have one country to the north, right? They're not a threat. Any Canadians in the room? You ain't a threat. We don't have two countries to the north who are marching down on us and another one coming in this direction, right? I mean, we've never been in King Ahaz's position, but haven't you been in a place where you wondered, God, what do I do? You've been in a financial place and you're like, I can either do this, this, or this, and maybe you have 2 or 3 options, and God is like, let's stop for a minute. Why don't you ask me? Like, what do you think I should do, God? Because maybe there's a third option or a fourth option or a fifth option that God is actually in. Have you ever been at work and stuck in maybe an ethical dilemma? Or going, God, how do I do this? I think someone's trying to push me out of my job. And you go, well, God, what do you want me to do? You had a conflict at home and you're like, I think I'm right about this, but yet I can either be right or be married. And I don't know, what do I do, God? God had a rescue plan for him. And remember, at the very heart of Christmas is a rescue plan. And I want you to see yourself in this story as a person who was caught between two things, pulling them in direction, and just pausing for a moment to say, God, what do you want? What's your plan? Let me give you a couple things. Number one, God's rescue plan required faith. It required faith. Let me read to you God's warning. If you still have your Bible open, chapter 7, halfway down verse 9, we'll call it verse 9b, all right? Here's God's warning to Ahaz. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. If you don't ask me, if you don't trust me, and if you don't take a look at who I am in this moment, listen, you won't be standing at all in the end. It's a clear warning to him. God's rescue plan required Ahaz to have this faith. One writer rewords it this way. He says, lean on me and you'll stand. But if you treat me as irrelevant, you will become irrelevant. God warns Ahaz. The second thing is this. It not only requires faith, but God's rescue plan made room for weak faith. See, I think sometimes we make the mistake of just having this, well, if God says it, I'm just going to do it. We're so afraid to doubt God or be skeptical of God at times. And can I be really honest? God can handle your doubt or your skepticism. To ask God, hey, God, I don't understand it. God, I'm scared. God, I'm unsure about this. God, I trust you, but man, I'm kind of terrified in these next moments. My career's at stake. My marriage is at stake. My kids are at stake. My health is at stake. God, what do you want me to do? God is not terrified by your doubt. He can handle your questions. God, in this moment, his rescue plan, he actually makes room for weak faith. One writer says it this way, and I love it. It says, God is attracted to weakness and need and honesty, but he is repelled by our self-assured pride. The thing that God can't handle is when we look at him and just go, God, I don't need you. I got 2 options. I don't like them, but I'm going to pick one. God, I don't want to hear about your opinion. God doesn't like that unbelievable independence. But he makes room for this weak faith, and I know that by the very next verse. Verse 10. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz through Isaiah, Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. He's saying, if you're having trust and believing, you're not sure, man, is God going to deliver me? What's his rescue plan? Should I ask him his opinion? Isaiah tells Ahaz, ask him for a sign. All right, God, what you want me to do? Give me a miraculous sign that you're in this and that you're going to rescue, you're going to deliver. I mean, how amazing is that? He said, no matter how high it is, no matter how deep it is, you just ask him for anything and God will give you a sign. Listen to Ahaz's response. Verse 12, but Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Sounds pious, right? It sounds like really noble. Like, you know what? I don't want to put God out. I don't want to ask God for something like that. I mean, that seems not very faith-like. That almost sounds like I don't trust God. He's not being noble. What he's saying is, I already have a plan. I don't care what God's plan is. And Ahaz, he makes this decision that he's going to side with the Assyrians in this. God's rescue plan, number 3 there, for humanity was confirmed by a sign. He's saying, just ask God for proof, and he'll give it to you. And Ahaz says, no thanks, because I already have an idea of what I want to do. And if you know this story, Assyria comes in and just, boom, wipes people out. It didn't turn out so well for King Ahaz. His people are sent off into exile, sent off into all these different directions. Ahaz failed as a king because he didn't have faith in God. He didn't trust God. He didn't ask God, God, what do you want? But here's what I love about the story. Even though it's a failure story, God's grace gets the last word because the story doesn't actually end there. If you go all the way down to verse 13, Isaiah is not done sharing. Then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David. Might as well have said Judah. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Listen, he said, ask God for a sign. He's like, no, I'm not going to ask God for a sign. God's like, you don't want my sign? I'm going to give it to you anyways. And here's the sign. The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Does that sound familiar? You know it because it's in Matthew chapter 1. It's the story of Christmas when Christ comes. Now, I want to stop for just a moment and pause because I want to make sure we understand something about Old Testament prophecy. And this is really, really important. For some of us today, as we read this, you're like, oh yeah, that was predicting that Jesus was to come. That's what makes it prophetic. Do you know that most Old Testament prophecy was not about something that would happen in New Testament times or times today? Most of what was prophetic words were what God was speaking to a situation of the day. It was something that was currently happening. So with prophetic words from God, there's often a meaning for the people right then and there who are hearing the story. And there's a dual meaning of something that is going to happen in the future. That's what makes it so miraculous and amazing. The word in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for virgin in this, do you know that it can mean virgin, but it was most commonly used to say young woman. When Isaiah heard this, when King Ahaz heard this, they would have heard that even though you're going to be wiped out by the Assyrians, I want you to hear this, there will be a young woman who will conceive and give birth to a son. And we'll call him Emmanuel. What he's saying is, you've made a choice, and you're going to suffer big time because of it under the Assyrians. But I want you to hear this. You will not be wiped off the face of the earth. There will be a son that will be born to continue your lineage. And what they're looking for is the immediate birth of a son that will continue their line. And if you keep reading the story, they start talking about the son as if he's currently arrived. They understood the son was a promise of their continuation. However, when Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, all these followers of Jesus, when they meet Jesus and they meet Mary and they meet Joseph and they hear how Mary conceived of a baby, they see this prophecy. And when Matthew writes about it, he says, the virgin will conceive and the virgin will give birth to a son. and they'll call him Jesus. Let me read to you the story as it goes. I'm going to read to you Matthew chapter 1, verse 20. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. And he said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. You know why the angel told Joseph that? This is not complicated. Men, you're engaged to a woman who you have never been with relationally. You with me? And she said, I've never been with a man ever. And then she comes to you once you're engaged and she says, I'm pregnant. You're like, who's the daddy? She's like, God. Joseph's like, this woman and me, she just broke my trust. And that is not the thing that Mary and Joseph had planned. And so an angel shows up and says, no, Joseph, she's actually telling you the truth. It's actually a gift that I'm giving you. And he says in verse 21, she'll give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus. Now, don't miss this. Because he will save, he will rescue his people from their sins. Listen. Ahaz's story is a rescue story. Jesus' story is a rescue story. The name Jesus actually means the Lord saves. I mean, God named his son, I'm going to rescue you. He's named the Lord saves. And the story goes on. Let me finish this. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Here it is. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they'll call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. What was promised way back 700 years in the book of Isaiah happens in Jesus. There's a son that's born that is the continuation of God rescuing his people. He's trying to rescue this nation, Judah, and they just go, no. We don't want you. God, we're going to side with the Assyrians, and maybe through that we'll survive. And God says, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. There's going to be a baby that's born. And the baby that he was talking about in the Old Testament there was a son born back then. They assume that that's going to be the line that will be carried through. But it's interesting because God actually once after their exile, God brings them back together as a nation. But he wasn't done with that sign. The next sign was that there was going to be a baby born to Mary and Joseph before they ever consummated their marriage, because it wasn't Joseph's son. It was the Son of God. And it's signs like that remind us that this story is a miraculous story. It's God's story. It's not something that people just made up. In Matthew chapter 1, let me make sure I make this very clear. Jesus was God's plan to rescue humanity, first of all, from sin. Because what did it say? You'll call him Jesus, because he'll save his people from their sin. The rescue plan is, first of all, to save you and I from our sin. Most of you know this if you're a Christian, you're a follower of Christ already. Our sin, our rebellion against God, it separates us from God. It puts a big barrier between him and us. We can't have a relationship with a holy God because we're sinful. He says, you need forgiveness. And he freely offers it. So he says, my son's going to come, live a perfect life, and he will be your sacrifice when he dies on a cross. His blood shed will provide your forgiveness so that you and I, we can have friendship. We can be family. That was God's rescue plan. But guess what? It didn't even stop there. Like King Ahaz, God wanted to rescue him not just from his sin, but from an enemy. Jesus, in one of his sermons, one of his speeches, he says this in John 10:10. He says, there's a thief out there, and there's a thief that comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus says, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. Do you know you have an enemy? And God's rescue plan is to rescue humanity from their enemy. There's a real devil. He really exists. He's a fallen angel. And he has a lot of minions called angels. And by the way, if some of you don't know me, you haven't been around well enough, I am not the kind of Christian that I'm looking for the devil under a rock, right? I mean, I don't think, I'll say it this way. I do a really good job of sinning all on my own. I don't think I need a demon or a devil to tempt me. I'm super capable of screwing up my own life and decisions, all right? You're probably not, though. But we have an enemy that is spiritual and would love to steal everything from you. And I don't mean your possessions. I mean your joy, your soul, your life. Kill your soul. By doing that, he keeps you separated from God. But listen, the same power that those two kings had on earth, the devil's power is nothing compared to the power of God. The only power he has is the power that God allows him to have for this temporary time. God's rescue plan was to rescue us from sin and enemy. And here's the third thing, from our self-ruled life. Think back to Isaiah 7. There's two people present there in that story that I want you to look at. There's King Ahaz and then Isaiah. Ahaz is the one who's like, no, I got my own plan. I don't want to do it this way. And Isaiah's like, don't. You're going to wreck this nation. You're going to wreck you. If you don't stand on this faith, this trust in God that he will rescue you, if you don't do that, he's saying you will not stand at all. Ahaz, you done. You made a dumb choice. Isaiah was a man of faith that's like, no, we got to trust God in this thing. What's the difference between the two men? I will tell you this, and I would encourage you, read this later this week. I'm not going to be able to teach much on this. I'm just going to read it to you and give you a couple points and kind of move on it. This is the main point, though. Isaiah had this unbelievable experience with God. He was on a first-name basis with God. He was a friend of God. Let me read to you his story real quick. It's in Isaiah chapter 6, just before chapter 7. And this is how it goes. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Now we're thinking this is a vision that he has had. He's had this experience with God. I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on the throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above God were these seraphim, these angels, each with 6 wings. 2 wings they covered their face, 2 wings they covered their feet, and 2 wings they're flying. And they called to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, and the whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Sounds like a Harry Potter movie, doesn't it? I'm guessing that you haven't had one of those experiences. I mean, like, I saw this vision of God, and it was, like, if you have, awesome. I'm not going to doubt you. I've never had that experience. But the experiences that I've had with God, when I've opened his word and I've sensed that he's actually speaking directly into my life from it, when I've stood in a worship gathering and sung and just tears go down my face because I realize the brokenness of my own soul, when I realize how much he loves me and he sacrificed his son on the cross and the joy is just overwhelming, I've had moments where I've been in God's presence. Have you? Like Isaiah, it's how well we know and experience God that gives us that faith and trust and confidence in him, that when we get to a crisis that says, God, I think I got this option or this option, he's like, ask me. And I can, because of I've spent time in his presence, I can say, God, I trust you. That you will rescue me from my sin, that you'll rescue me from my enemy, and that you'll rescue me from myself. From my self-dependent, non-wanting God kind of life. Isaiah recognizes God's power. It doesn't end there, though. When he recognizes how holy God is, this is his response. Woe to me, I cried out. I'm ruined, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Isaiah admitted his guilt and his weakness. When he finally understood who God was, he's like, I'm terrible. It's not a call to low self-esteem. It's a call to a recognition of your own brokenness in humanity, that you violated God's holiness. Now listen. Some of you, I know you think like you're really good at some things, and there's some things about you, that maybe you don't make wise choices all the time. It's called sin, but whatever. If I offered you a glass of water, I just use this illustration all the time because it's just super easy. Clear, pure glass of water. Refreshing. Maybe it needs to be a different illustration. Hot tea. But it's pure. And if I took a raw piece of chicken that had been sitting out for 4 days in the sun, and not in the whole thing, I wouldn't take a drumstick and like rub it around there, but just a corner of that raw, salmonella-filled piece of chicken, just kind of touched it in that water or warm tea. Who wants a drink? It's mostly good. I mean, it's filled with a lot of good things. I know it's kind of contaminated just a little bit, but I only touched a little bit of it, right? Who wants a drink? It's the same with you and me. No matter how much good we do, we still have this contamination of sin about us that has to be solved. And Jesus solved it on the cross when he died for us. By my blood, I pay for your sins. Isaiah received that forgiveness. Listen to what it says next. Then one of the seraphim, one of these angels, flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth, and he said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sins atoned for. Have you ever felt what Isaiah felt and received the forgiveness of God? And like, God, I know you're holy, and I know I'm not, but I am overwhelmed by how much you've forgiven me because you love me. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever been in God's presence like that? I have. And it's faith building. Because of where I've been with God, I can trust him with what's going on tomorrow. Because of where I've been with God and the experiences I've had, I can trust him with my today. It doesn't even end there, though. After he receives forgiveness, then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? He's asking. In chapter 6, we have this whole nation of Judah, and so many of them are walking away from me. Who's going to go and be my man? Who's going to go and speak for me and tell them the truth? Tell them I love them, that they can trust me, that I will rescue them. Who's going to do that? Because Isaiah knew how big his God was and knew how he loved him, knew how he'd forgiven him. Isaiah's like, me? You can send me. Why? The only reason that Isaiah says you can send me is because he had an experience with God, that he knew the power and the love and the goodness of God. You with me? Listen, we have a whole city that we are here, and we're saying we want to make an impact and a difference in the Silicon Valley. You will not make a difference in the Silicon Valley until you know the power of your God, the love that he has for you, the forgiveness. The more time you spend in his presence, when you have an option in front of you, you're going to pause and say, God, what you want? What way do I go? What do I do? Isaiah, in this, he recognizes God's power. He admitted his guilt and his weakness. He received forgiveness, and he was willing to follow God. He says, here I am. Would you send me? Let me land this plane. If you're not a follower of Christ, recognize that the Christmas story is God's rescue plan for you. God been rescuing people, his people, from all kinds of enemies in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, it was all about this land that he was trying to bring his people to and give them a place to flourish. In the New Testament, it's not about you and I having a land. Our place, our home, the place he promised for us is in heaven. He says, I'm going to go away, and I'm going to go to heaven. I'm going to prepare a place for you. When the time is right, I will come back to get you. He says, no one, though, goes to heaven, goes to God, goes to the Father, except through me. Listen. If you're not a follower of Christ, will you have faith, even if it's weak faith, to say, God, I believe this. I believe you want to rescue me. I believe that Jesus was your son. I believe he died for me. For some of you, you need to make that decision before you move any further. And once you do, you're going to have a relationship with God. And like Isaiah, I'm not asking you to have a vision, all right? I'm asking you to spend time with God and God's people, so that you can be overwhelmed with how good and big God is. Because in our world, our problems seem to be so big, and our God feels like he's so small. But when you spend time with him and get to know him, and you see what he could have done for King Ahaz, if Ahaz would have been, I'm all in. When you spend time with God, you realize how large he is and how small our problems are. Your problems are a smoldering stick compared to the might of your God. Hey, if you need to give your life to Christ and become a Christian, do it. Tell him that you believe. Ask him for his forgiveness. For those of you that you've done that, you've been there and you're walking with him, my question for you is a little bit different. Will you have faith in God's rescue plan for others? You can say, I have big faith, or I have medium-sized faith. Oh, I got small faith that God will use me to rescue people in this valley, my family, my friends who don't yet know God. But the truth and the reality is, it doesn't actually matter what we say. The amount of faith that we have will be revealed by our actions. We can say we have great faith, but it will be revealed when we're willing to build friendships with people and earn the right to share who God is with them. But if we're going to stay isolated to our own Christian community and not build relationships with people outside of the church, we're revealing the amount of faith that we have. If we're not willing to pray for people, someone shares with us, man, this is crazy. This is going on right now. Hey, I'll pray for you. Oh, what? No one ever tells me that. We're in the workplace. Can you say that here? Like, I think so. Or what if the opportunity arises and you said, can I just pray for you, like right now? See, the size of your faith will be revealed by how you engage people on a spiritual level. Will you bring up spiritual conversations with people? Because we can say we have great faith, but our faith is revealed by our actions. And you can be King Ahaz or you can be Isaiah. For God's rescue plan to flourish, he's looking for a group of Isaiahs who will engage their city in such a way that they believe that the resistance of the people there is no match for the power of God. After all, he rescued you, didn't he? Christmas time. It's God's rescue story. He's rescuing humanity from sin, from their enemy, from their self-ruled life. And what he's looking for is a bunch of people like you. Some people who have had an experience with God, like Isaiah. And he says, who's going to go change this valley? And he's looking for people to stand up and say, here I am. God, it's me. Not because of how good I am or how I'm going to do this, but because I believe in your power and your love and your goodness. So it doesn't matter how we respond to this morning with our words. It matters how we respond to it this week with our actions. Let's bow and pray. God, give us courage. Lord, give us an understanding of your presence, that you are bigger than our obstacles. You're bigger than the hardships that we're experiencing. God, you're bigger than the resistance that some people are having in our lives, our family, at work. God, that I pray you would help us to humbly depend upon you, to be the kind of people that will lean on you and trust you in your rescue plan. And we would participate with you in it. God, we're not bystanders. We're not just people who are wallflowers and watching your plan. You want to use us, so here we are. God, send us to make a difference this Christmas. And if you agree with that, would you say amen? Would you stand with us? Let's sing.